My mother's new husband called me. He was basically trying to invite me to Christmas, claiming that it would be nice for me to get to know my other siblings. I won't lie, I laughed and let him know that his children were not my siblings and that it would be beneficial for us both if he quite literally forgot that I existed. What caught me off guard was the fact that he kept asking me when my birthday was and what all my mother actually told me. I was quite honestly going to tell him to go screw himself, but he had me curious, so I told him. He paused for a long time before telling me that he would really like to see me for Christmas. It was such a weird and cryptic conversation that I did end up going. I even decided to bring my grandma. She was not happy about going, but she put on her Sunday's best nonetheless and accompanied me to dinner. Our timing was impeccable because by the time we got there, the food was already ready. My mom looked kind of surprised to see my grandma, but in my opinion, she shouldn't have been. Either way, the dinner was so excruciatingly awkward that I ended up spending half the time looking at their tree and wondering if any of the presents under it were for me. But I was quickly snapped out of my thoughts when my mother's husband dismissed the two children from the table and looked my mother in the face just to ask, "Is Janice my daughter?" My grandmother dropped her fork and I nearly choked on my water, but my mother's new husband, we'll call him Brian, didn't even notice because he was so focused on my mom's face. After my grandmother finally regained her composure, she raised a brow in my mother's direction because she, like the rest of us, wanted an answer. I expected my mom to deny it, but instead she looked down at her plate and said, "I don't know." My grandmother was not satisfied with that answer. In fact, she urged my mother to explain herself, but after a few moments of her silence, Brian finally spoke up. According to him, he was aware that my mother was in an abusive relationship. In fact, he was one of the people that urged her to get out of it, not just for her safety, but because he was in love with her. He didn't deny that they were fooling around, but when my mother made it clear that she wasn't interested in leaving the situation she was in, he demanded that she choose him or my father. My mother chose my father, which was the last straw for Brian, and he left. A couple of years passed before he saw her again, and when she ran into him, she made it clear that she no longer had attachments with my father. He didn't even know I existed until last year when my grandmother got in contact with her about me. She told him that my father and her had a baby together and that she revoked her rights and moved on. But when I showed up on the doorstep, he looked into my eyes and saw the eyes of his other two daughters and started to question everything my mother has said so far. Now he wanted to know the truth, and so did the rest of us. When my mother finally spoke up, she explained that she was unsure. She knew that she had been involved with Brian and my father at the same time, but she assumed that I was my father's because she felt the timelines added up, and even went so far as to say that I looked more like my father than Brian, only to see me now and not be sure. Brian was angry, but he was nowhere near as angry as my grandmother. Before anyone could say anything, my grandmother stood up from the table, yelling at my mother, "You mean to tell me that you abandoned this child with my son and you weren't even sure if he was the father?" I can't honestly remember the rest of the argument because I was deep in my own little world. She left me with him, knowing that he was an abuser, and with full knowledge that he may not even be my father, all the while starting a new life with a new man who apparently wasn't new at all. That could have also been my father? Yeah, I was losing it, and everyone's arguing did nothing but make me even more furious. Before I could stop myself, my hand slammed against the table. When I finally fixed myself to speak, I said, "I don't care about the circumstances, and I don't care about your arguing. A paternity test needs to be done. When I find out who my father is, I will deal with you then." And I stormed out. My ride home with my grandmother was excruciatingly silent until she finally said, "No matter what way these results go, you will always be my granddaughter." And I appreciated her for that, but she and I wasted no time getting the paternity test materials. The hard part was having to contact my dad and tell him everything that happened. You won't believe what he said.